everyone. I'm Grace Beatty, and welcome to Wicked Women, the podcast. Step back in time with me as we learn about some of the most infamous and maligned women in history. Speaking with leading experts, I will discuss these women's backstories and the circumstances that gave them the title of Wicked. In this season of Wicked Women, I will be focusing on some well-known and some lesser-known women in history who have acquired an unsavory reputation. In the end, this podcast does not look to excuse or dispute the wrongs committed by some of these women, but it is also not looking to completely villainize them. Instead, I hope this can be a conversation starter on the complicated legacies prescribed to women in history. In today's episode, I will analyze Marquise de Brinvilliers, a French woman executed for poisoning her father, brothers, and others in the 15th century. Discussing Marie's life and legacy with me today will be Professor Benedetta Duramy, a professor of law at California's Golden Gate University and a participating scholar in the book Women Criminals, an Encyclopedia of People and Issues. Continue listening to learn more about this little-known woman from history. On a hot, humid Parisian July day, the aristocratic Marquise de Brinvilliers was carted out to the scaffold before a seething crowd. Marie was accused of poisoning over 50 people, including her own father and brothers. The massive crowd on July 17, 1676, had come to witness a common entertainment, an execution. Throughout history, witnessing an execution has been a common aspect of societal life. It served many different purposes, as a warning, of retribution, and for entertainment. The executions of murderers were particularly popular, as it showed a public punishment for a crime many viewed as reprehensible. Marquise de Brinvilliers has run the gamut of public opinion, from femme fatale to hapless victim to hysterical woman to feminist icon. There may be a part truth in all these, but the real Marie never got to tell her own story. The legacy we have today has come to us through a tortured confession and journalistic flair. Marquise d'Aubray was born in Paris in 1630 to a politically influential father, Antoine Dru d'Aubray, and his wealthy wife, Marie Ollier. The eldest of 5 children, Marie would grow up in a world of wealth and privilege. In her confession later in life, she would assert that she had been sexually assaulted at the age of 7, shattering her happy childhood. However, she would never name her attacker. In 1651, at the age of 21, Marie married Antoine Gobelin, Marquis de Brinvilliers, and it would have appeared that her life would take on the traditional narrative for aristocratic women. As Benedetta Duramy discusses.
So what I found and what I still find more interesting about her is that her story starts off as a traditional one, right? And then it becomes very untraditional, if you want, because she was highly born, the eldest of 5 children. Her family belonged to the legal group of the magistracy, which obviously retained at the time much prestige and reputation in the society. And, like traditionally at that time, she was married off to Antoine Gobelin, that was a Marquis de Brinvilliers, at the only age of 17. And so that's when she joined the French aristocratic entourage. And so the marriage, and that's again traditional, was most likely arranged between the families. And as it was back then, she was, obviously portrayed as a woman of much attraction and intelligence. And her husband instead was depicted as a man without morals, a man without strong personal character, weak as water, and unstable as sand. That's what, the contemporaries ultimately wrote about him. And so Again, very traditionally, within a few years of marriage, she became the mistress of an attractive young army officer, Gaudin de Sainte-Croix, and the affair between the two of them was tolerated initially by her husband until it collided with with his financial interests. And so that's when actually her story becomes non-traditional and more interesting. So that's what I find interesting, the fact that her story is incredibly traditional up until a certain point, but then becomes, a very different story, and definitely not traditional, and definitely not in line with what with what the societal expectations were at the time.
The Brinvilliers marriage appears to have been an open one, with both discreetly taking lovers throughout their early years together. Marie went on to have 7 children, but after her trial and conviction, it was asserted that the majority were not legitimate. The date of Marie's meeting with Gaudin de Sainte-Croix is not recorded, but by the early 1660s, they were involved in a scandalously public affair. By this point, Marie's husband was drowning in debt and would soon leave France to escape his creditors, leaving Marie to conduct her affair on her own terms. This state of event horrified Marie's father, Antoine d'Aubray. In an attempt to forcibly end his daughter's affair, Antoine effected a lettre de cachet, an arrest document signed by the king, and had Gaudin de Sainte-Croix thrown in the Bastille. This is where the infamous story surrounding Marie began. Here is Benedetta.
Basically, what happened is that following her lover's advice, Marie de Brinvilliers began to actually consider initiating legal action to separate her fortune from the one of the husband that was, dissipating their joint patrimony. And that created a public scandal. Her father and her 2 brothers, concerned about the negative reputation that this could reflect on the entire family, pressed Marie to break off the relationship. And despite the pressure from her family, she continued the relationship with Sainte-Croix, and that led her father to the extreme action of requesting the king to issue an order of arrest, which was in French called lettre de cachet, against Gaudin de Sainte-Croix. And therefore, her lover was publicly arrested and was transported to the fortress prison of the Bastille in Paris. And during his months of custody, he was trained by this Italian poisoner, Exili, that had been accused of many crimes. And when he came out of custody, under his guidance, Marie de Brinvilliers began actually experimenting with lethal poisons. She started testing them on her own servants and on the patients of the Hôtel de Dieu, that was the great public hospital. And, as many ladies of the Parisian nobility at the time, she volunteered to visit the sick at the hospital, and so she was kind of allowed to wander around the halls. And apparently she was serving sweets and biscuits and wine to her unfortunate patients, who invariably died soon afterwards.
Through her work at the hospital in Paris, Marie began to perfect her arsenic-based poison with a very specific goal in mind. Benedetta elaborates.
But she was still enraged with her own family, and she was aspiring to appropriate actually the entire family fortune. And that's why she poisoned her father in 1666 and then her 2 brothers in 1670. Although the crimes were not detected, the autopsies in fact stated that they had died of natural causes, or what they called the malignant humor. But in 1672, upon the mysterious death of her lover, that probably occurred in one of the lethal experiments that he was conducting, some incriminating letters and conclusive evidence against Marie de Brinvilliers were actually discovered by the police. So she left and she fled to London and later to Holland, and then she finally, in 1675, was arrested in a convent in Liège and was transported back in France.
After the mysterious death of Gaudin de Sainte-Croix, suspicion fell on Marie for the first time. After fleeing for England, Marie was arrested and brought back to Paris to stand trial on April 29, 1676. Benedetta delves into the details of Marie's trial.
So, during the trial, I think what is interesting, by the way, is that she was initially denied the aid of a legal counsel. And so she stood alone in her own defense. And initially, she stubbornly refused to admit that she had poisoned her father and their two brothers. And in her defense, she proclaimed their innocence and accused actually her former lover of Gaudin de Saint Croix of having deceived her. But the judges, found her guilty. And then right before and during the painful torture of water, and as we know, when, in those moments, it's unclear whether confession comes out of desperation and fear. But right before and during the painful torture of water, she ended up confessing to have poisoned her father and their two brothers, as well as having attempted to poison her sister-in-law and her husband several times. And she also admitted having committed the utmost crimes. And I think this is, by the way, going back to the non-traditional story, she basically said that she had committed those out of ambition for her family and her children. So she wanted to assure herself and her offspring the family fortune that her father instead had assigned entirely to his male successors. So she was going against, what the rules were back at the time. And so intention to ensure that her children could receive the education and the social ranking that they deserved, the Marquise de Brinvilliers had decided to poison her father and her brothers. But, as I said before, her murder ultimately revealed that poisoning was actually an obscure cause of many mysterious deaths that had occurred in the elite society. And before execution, in fact, she said, out of so many guilty people, must I be the only one to be put to death? And yet, after people in town are involved in this sort of thing, and I could ruin them if I were to talk. But she never betrayed her accomplices and basically only admitted having used the arsenic, the vitriol, and the venom of Todd as poisons and the milk as antidote. So, she did confess. And it's definitely true that back at the time, love potions and spells and black magic and, poisons were used by, some of these women ultimately to regain control, to be honest, of their personal lives and also of their finances, right? So she may have been guilty, I think, but ultimately I don't think that's the meaning of her story.
Marie was found guilty of poisoning her father and brothers. On July 17, 1676, Marie de Brinvilliers was beheaded and her body was thrown on a pyre to be burned. Marie's death did not see the end of her legacy. Her trial and execution would draw attention to other recent mysterious deaths, and officially begin what is now termed l'affaire de poison, or the affairs of the poisons. This incident stretched from 1676 to 1682, and saw numerous aristocrats accused of poisonings and witchcraft. Marie's legal case captivated French audiences everywhere. Here is Benedetta on why she thinks Marie's trial caused such a sensation, not only in France, but around Europe.
Oh, I think because ultimately, it was something so extraordinary, right? And so, in a way, unexpected by someone that belonged to the aristocratic world. Although, back then, and that's when, in fact, the Affair of the Poisons started, there were more and more members, even of the aristocratic world, that were actually, disappearing and they were, poisoned, right? So actually, this was just the beginning of the Affair of the Poisons. But I think there was this sense of fascination in and around her, both on the side of, the criminal side, if you want, and on the side of she must have had reasons to kind of behave that way. And I think to some extent, maybe you could probably start already seeing that her story was somewhat more a story of resistance and the story of agency than the story of simply of a criminal. Because a woman of such high origin and beauty and intelligence was considered not capable of such crimes. So I think it goes back to the same, societal bias, if you want, right? And stigma that, it was unthinkable that someone, so gentle and so beautiful and so intelligent and coming from, such a reputable milieu could be capable of the most serious crimes.
After her death, Marie's story was subsumed into national lore surrounding l'affaire de Poison and female killers. Marie's story continued to capture the public imagination, but the narrative built up around her usually focused more on society's own shock and horror at the capability of a woman to murder. As Benedetta points out,
so I would say, back at the time, and I think now, obviously, experts and scholars have a different outlook about her story, but definitely back at the time, the perception was that someone like her of, high origins and beauty and intelligence wouldn't be capable of murder and poisoning her own family members and attempting to poison, as she apparently did, her sister-in-law and even her husband multiple times, right? And in fact, during the trial and after her confession, the chief of the Paris police, Nicolas Gabriel de la Reynier, he actually wondered, and here I'm just actually citing what he says, who would have believed it of this woman of highly respectable family, of a delicate little creature such as this, with her apparently gentle disposition. So I think, the misconception obviously was that it was out of the imagination to see someone like her coming from, a respectable family and, being a very delicate and gentle human being, to be able and in fact to be capable of doing like that. But the misconception, I think, was also, then it became a bit, broader, because she was beheaded publicly and burned on a pile of wood in 1676. And, she was on the one hand considered like a dissolute criminal until the day of her execution. But then she became kind of a martyr for the population. And in fact, one of her contemporaries noticed that at her decapitation, crowds of people came, and the entire city came basically to see the spectacle, right? And the city had never been so aroused, so intent on a spectacle like that. And then apparently the next day, the same contemporary reported that the people were searching through the ashes for La Brinvilliers' bones. So I think she had this, very fascinating and perverse image from, different kind of members of the society.
Today's society is still fascinated with killers, who they are, why they did it, how they did it. Media like podcasts, books, and television are filled with true crime stories from throughout history. In particular, society seems to be fascinated by women who kill, a fact that seems to both horrify and fascinate us. Female killers apparently break the mold of maternal feminine goodness to commit a crime of often brutal proportions. Benedetta discusses the public fascination with female criminals from history and in the present.
Female that commit murder have gone against the societal stereotype that basically pictures women as custodians of, family peace and customs and morals, and pictures them as nurturing members of the community and therefore incapable of the most serious crimes. That they have gone against this stereotype. How is it possible that women, that they are instead supposed to be, mothers, well, that they are in many cases mothers, and therefore they have a very nurturing and peaceful nature, obviously, again, going back into the stereotypes, how is it possible that they are capable of something so horrible?
Benedetta reanalyzes Marie de Brinvilliers' story, not as one of a heartless murderess, but as one of female resistance in an era where power lay solely in the hands of men. Here's Benedetta.
I wish that the story of Marie de Brinvilliers was seen as a story of female resistance and female agency. As a matter of fact, at the time, women often, as I mentioned before, resorted to poisons, love powders, and black magic to put an end to domestic abuse and financial dependence, right? So the physical and verbal assaults perpetrated against them were often hidden behind closed doors and by the privacy that was accorded to family matters. And violence against women and even violence against children was actually regularly employed by men in the households to control them and correct their faults. And so since the 5th century in Europe, harsh punishment and severe reprisals were actually encouraged to any disobedient spouse to reestablish domestic peace. And spousal correction was not only performed based on the love of power, but also as a supreme sense of duty, as a form of, exercising a sense of duty. That was obviously intertwined with the doctrine of couverture that restricted women's legal and economic agency under the protection and cover of their husbands, and therefore spousal correction eventually encompassed intimate abuse and created an imbalance in gender relationships. And so many women used love magic to obtain financial security, for example, and to have power over the spirit, the heart, and the goods of their husbands. And if the love spells turned out to be inadequate to achieve their goals, women then subsequently resorted to Venus potions and black rituals. And some of them, for example, aimed at remarrying for love, being aware that a second marriage could not be celebrated without ending the previous one. And even for the female members of the aristocracy and wealthy, powerful families, the chances of being granted a divorce were very slim. And even in the case that women were accorded a divorce, they typically would have not been able to marry again. So poisoning their husbands seemed to be a viable way for a lot of women to end unhappy and abusive marriages, as well as to regain control of the household finances and patrimonies. And so considering the unequal and subservient conditions that women endured during the 17th century in France, both from a legal standpoint and from a financial standpoint, it's not surprising that the poison became a weapon that was widely employed by women, in fact, to exercise their agency against paternal and spousal authority and abuse, right? And so in such a scenario, the story of Marie de Brinvilliers and then the subsequent affair of the poisons ultimately unveiled, right, a French underworld of sacrilegious magic, premeditated crimes of passion, but at the same time, women's resistance to patriarchy and social subordination.
In the end, Marie's legacy is a complicated one. Much evidence points to the fact that she did kill her father, brothers, and many innocent patients in hospitals. At the same time, when analyzed more deeply, her story does not appear black and white, a simple story of a hysterical woman on a murderous rampage. While Marie may not deserve exoneration, that opinion is up to you, her legacy does deserve a more holistic narrative.